Turn in your Bible, if you would, to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11. Last lesson we covered Aaron's two older sons bringing in strange fire before God in the tabernacle and facing severe judgment for that as they lost their lives because of their defiance of God's commands and refusal to submit to His will. While the Israelites generally were allowed to mourn because of the situation, Aaron and his two other sons were serving as priests at that time, and so they were prohibited from showing any outward signs of mourning, like rending the garments and doing the different things that typically would be done in that culture to show their sorrow because they represented God to the people, and to mourn for the loss because of rebellion in this way would send the wrong kind of message about God's holiness. And that was really their chief concern, was to be representatives of God. We also saw some other guidelines and provisions for the priests, kind of put into practice some that we've already talked about a little bit in the offerings, that portions were to be given for their meals and things like that. Here we saw that kind of put into practice as Moses gives those instructions, and then the chapter kind of ends up with a little bit of confusion about a particular offering, a goat offering for a sin for the congregation that had been made. Moses thought Aaron and his sons should have eaten it. They burned it instead, and their explanation was that they didn't feel like they were worthy to eat of that particular sacrifice due to the situations that had happened and their state of mind, basically. And with all that had gone on, and Moses and God seemed content with that. And so we move on to chapter 11, where we get into some of the dietary restrictions for the nation of Israel. Now, for most people, if you're wanting to really get in the Bible and start studying, this isn't the passage that you go to, right off the bat. It's not what we think of when we think, man, I want something exciting in the Scriptures. How about dietary laws? That sounds fun. None of us like dietary laws in our own lives, right? I don't want to have to go on a diet, and so, hearing what I can and cannot eat, primarily what I cannot eat, I don't want to hear that, and so why would we want to study that in Scriptures? But it is in the Scriptures, and it was recorded, and there are purposes for these things. And so we're going to look at some of these and see what we can draw from them this evening. So we're going to start off Leviticus chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Here the Bible says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth." And so here God speaks to Moses and Aaron, giving them these instructions that are to be passed on to the people regarding the kinds of animals that they can and cannot use for food. The regulation of diet served a few different purposes. One is that it provided another means of separation for the Israelites from the cultures around them. And this may be kind of the primary application or the primary purpose that God had in mind for these restrictions. Sharing a meal with someone is a form of connecting with that person. In fact, the word company, not like a business, but like keeping company, or you're having company over. What do you have them over for? Well, you have company over for dinner, right? That's just how the saying goes, and there's reason for that. The word company itself actually means together in bread. Having bread together, eating together. And so that idea of companionship, that idea of coming together, it really focuses on the idea of having a meal, especially in that culture, in that time. It was prominent. But even today, when we think of some of the people that we're close to, typically that's the people that we would be most likely to dine with. And you don't often sit at a table with a complete stranger for a meal. You eat with those people who are close to you. And so the idea of separating your diet, separating the things you will eat and the things you won't eat from those that the people around you eat, these foreigners, these pagans, it adds to that distinction of God's people from the world. The separation of God's people from those who are around them. And we know that for the nation of Israel, this was a great challenge that they faced, to remain separate, to not allow those false ideologies, the false worship, the false religions, to creep in and to become something that they were focused on or that they fell into. We see it happen over and over again. So this is one of the means that God would use to try to keep that from happening. If I'm not willing to sit down and have a meal with you because I can't eat what you eat, then that's going to make it harder for me to intermingle with you and to become a part of whatever it is that you're doing. And so that idea of separation, of holiness, of distinction between God's people and the world is certainly a major aspect of what's going on here. Another aspect of that separation has been suggested is that the animals deemed unclean may have been associated with the gods of the Canaanites, the different nations around the Promised Land. Now, I didn't go into a real in-depth study of all those false gods. Certainly some of them were tied to different creatures, different animals. We know from Israel's history, even just before this time period, right, at Mount Sinai, as Moses went up the first time to get the law, what did the Israelites do? Well, he'd been gone several days, and they turned to Aaron and they're like, hey, he's gone. We need a God of our own. And so what does Aaron do? Oh, okay, well, give me all your gold. And in his words, he just threw it in the fire and out pops this calf. Of course, we know in reality it didn't quite work like that. But they end up with the golden calf anyway, right? And they worship it. They were prone to that ideology, that mindset coming out of Egypt. Now, the calf was an Egyptian god, most likely. But it seems to me like many of the Canaanite gods may have been along the same lines. And so I don't know that that's the particular reason or how valid of a reason that would be, because I would imagine that some of the clean animals were worshipped as well. But it may have been another means of kind of separating them from false worship and trying to keep the Israelites away from those pagan practices. And then there's also the practical benefits that come with these particular dietary restrictions that were given that could promote the overall health and well-being of the people. I think this, there's some obvious truth there and some obvious benefits of the way that they ate and the things that they were going to eat and the things that they wouldn't eat. The animals that were consecrated or that were considered clean were generally plant eaters, and so those would be less likely to fall into a disease state and would be safer for them to eat. Not only that, as far as partaking of them, but also the keeping of them. They were less likely to become diseased and therefore spread that among the people. Because remember, especially early on during this wilderness time period, now initially it should have only been a short time before they got to the Promised Land and took the Promised Land. But they refused to go in when they got there the first time, and so as judgment they were condemned to wander around for 40 years while those generations died off and a new generation rose up. And so you've got an extended period of time in the wilderness, an extended period of time of relative close proximity as they would, journey from one place to the next place. They would set up camp and then they would stay there for however long it was that God deemed fit. But you've got people kind of packed together in a relatively small area. And so obviously the threat of disease and things like that is magnified in those situations. And so for that instance or for that time period, it was especially beneficial. But even after they got to the Promised Land, these things would generally be healthier and better for them than maybe some of the things that were considered unclean that we'll get to as we look through this. So there's a lot of different benefits and a lot of different purposes that we see here. And there's a lot of other ones that people speculate on. And, reading through some of this, I was just amazed by the leaps that people take. We'll get to the fish here in a second. And they said, well, maybe fins represent the spiritual, something about Christians reaching out to other people. And I'm thinking, I don't know how you get that from saying you can eat stuff with fins and you can't eat stuff without it. But, maybe they're just a lot more learned and spiritual than I am. And I'm just a simpleton. But I'm okay with that. So we'll just keep on going. We start off here in this first section. It's divided kind of into 4 different groups of creatures. It begins here with the beasts, and that's kind of things that walk around on 4 legs, cows and dogs and cats and lions and camels and all those kind of things that we're talking about here. And so that's this first section, verses 2 through 8. Gives the details about them. It says, speaking to the children of Israel, saying, these are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Whatsoever parteth the hoof and is cloven-footed and cheweth the cud among the beasts, that shall ye eat. Nevertheless, these shall ye not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that divide the hoof. As the camel, because it cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the swine, though he divide the hoof, and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud, he is unclean unto you. Of the flesh of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch. They are unclean unto you. And so, in the retelling of this portion of the law over in the book of Deuteronomy, it actually gives a list of 10 animals that are considered clean, 3 that are kind of domesticated, and 3 that are wild animals. But they all have these same characteristics. In fact, Deuteronomy spells out the same requirements there, that they have to be cloven-footed and they have to chew the cud. And so that speaks of the hooves of the animals clearly, and so things like a horse or something like that is not suitable, wouldn't be considered acceptable in their diet. And so it's pretty specific on that. He actually goes through a few examples there, right, and talks about the camel. The camel, the end of the foot is kind of split a little bit, but at the back it's tied together, and so it's not completely parted into 2 parts. And so he is unfit. It chews the cud. It has that, what's that word that's used? Starts with an R. It speaks of their digestion. I can't remember what the word is. It's in my notes, but I'm not looking at them. So, but it speaks of the digestive process. It follows the right digestion, but it doesn't have the cloven foot. Then it goes on to the coney, which is a small rabbit, and the hare, which is a larger rabbit. And both of them, they chew like an animal that chews the cud. Technically, they're not the same kind of animal or the same kind of digestion either, but they do chew a whole lot. If you've ever watched a rabbit eat, right, it's just that mouth's constantly going. But they obviously don't have a hoof at all, right? They have a paw or something along those lines, and so it's not acceptable. Why these particular animals were mentioned here is you can't eat these. Probably has to do with the prevalence of them, how readily available they were in that region and would be in the Promised Land, and the likelihood of people to eat them, and perhaps even the tendency in the past that they had eaten these particular animals beforehand. Because remember, up until the law, the prevailing requirement from God was that you could eat animals. You just couldn't eat the blood, and that was established when Noah got off the ark. God established that rule. Now for his chosen nation, he's adding to that rule and giving some more qualifications. And so he speaks of those things. And then the most famous one, I suppose, among the restrictions is that of pork, right? They couldn't eat swine because while it had the right hoof, it had the right feet, it didn't chew the cud. It doesn't have that same dietary or that same digestion process that the other animals have. And from what I understand, pigs are likely to get into bad stuff and eat all kinds of things. I've always heard, that goats will eat anything. Just throw a tin can out there. I don't know if it's just our goats, but they're picky. We've tried to get them to eat all kinds of stuff, carrots and lettuce, and they don't want any of it. So maybe we just got snobby goats, I don't know. But the pigs will generally eat whatever you put in front of them. And so that, again, adds a potential for problems as far as the sanitation. And if you've been around pigs, you know that they're not real sanitary anyway. That's the beasts that walk on all fours. And it does specify that they weren't to eat them. Not only that, they weren't to touch the carcass of these animals. And so they weren't to deal with the dead animals at all, or they would be considered unclean. And again, these are ceremonial things that we're talking about here, but these are restrictions that were placed upon them. The second group includes animals that live in the water, basically, verses 9 through 12. These shall ye eat of all that are in the waters, whatsoever hath fins and scales in the waters, in the sea and in the rivers, thou shalt eat them, or them shall ye eat. And all that have not fins and scales in the sea and in the rivers, of all that move in the water, and of any living thing which is in the waters, they shall be an abomination unto you. They shall be even an abomination unto you, and ye shall not eat of their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. Whatsoever hath no fins nor scales in the waters, that shall be an abomination unto you. And so he lays it out very thoroughly, repeats himself a few times, but this is speaking of water-dwelling creatures, and anything that doesn't have scales and fins is forbidden. Anything that has both scales and fins is acceptable. He doesn't give a list of examples here. There doesn't lay out a lot of details there, but just from reading that, it's kind of clear what we're talking about. Clearly that makes crustacean and shellfish and things like that off the menu. Those things are forbidden. It makes catfish no good. I like catfish. The pork thing doesn't bother me. The catfish thing, I like catfish, but that wasn't acceptable because they don't have visible scales. They do have fins, but they don't have both. And then, of course, things like squid and all the other things that are out there. Only fish with scales and fins were acceptable, and that goes for saltwater and freshwater. It didn't make any difference. The requirement was the same. Spiritual applications of fins and scales, I don't know. Go read some commentaries and you'll find all kinds of ideas about those. The third thing that it talks about are birds, or really it's things that fly. We would generally lump it in as birds, but we'll see that there's a little bit more than just that. Verses 13 through 19. And these are they which ye shall have an abomination among the fowls that shall not be eaten. They are an abomination: the eagle and the ossifrage and the osprey and the vulture and the kite after his kind, every raven after his kind, and the owl and the night hawk and the cuckoo and the hawk after his kind, and the little owl and the cormorant and the great owl and the swan and the pelican and the gyre eagle and the stork and the heron after her kind, and the lapwing and the bat. All fowls that, that's the next section. Okay, so that deals with the flying things, okay? And it is a whole list of birds. He doesn't really give any specific qualifications, like if it has this kind of beak or this kind of feathers or anything like that. It's a list of things that are prohibited. So any other kind of fowl seemingly would be acceptable. In this list, one of the things that people like to point out in this particular section is, well, they put bat with the birds, and a bat is not a bird, right? Yeah, that is right. Does he say bats and birds? No, he says fowls. And so a lot of people want to point at that and say, well, see, the Bible's got errors in it, right? It doesn't fit with science. The problem is that that the way that the animals are divided, it's two different ways of categorizing them. It doesn't mean that the Bible's wrong in the way that it does it. It means that the Bible was speaking to people hundreds and hundreds of years ago who didn't have the same taxonomical system that we have with genes and genus and species and all that stuff, kingdoms and all that. He was talking to people and communicating what they were and were not to eat. These people would look at a bat and say it flies, and so it fits into that category. We look at a bat and say it's a mammal, and so it fits in a different category. It just depends on how you divide them up. So the Bible isn't wrong, okay? It's just this is how it's dividing it up, and it says that the bat is one of those that you're not supposed to be eating. Which again, that works well for me. I don't think I've never been tempted to eat a bat, so I could be a Jew in that area. But the idea there, again, it does kind of tie to the beast requirements. Remember, the beast, they had to chew the cud, and so that points out that they are herbivores, right? They just eat grass or plants. The animals that were forbidden of the beast were those typically that would either be carnivorous, eating flesh only, or that would be omnivores that will just eat anything, like a vulture or the pigs and things like that. That will just kind of eat whatever's in front of them. And so the idea with the birds here seems to fall in those same lines, because the birds listed here generally are birds of prey, birds that kill other things and eat them, or that eat things that are already dead. And so the restriction there would seem to go in line with that, and that does kind of fit in with the whole idea about cleanliness and even the spiritual applications of it, because remember what God told Noah was that the life is in the blood. And so the idea would be that you don't eat animals that eat blood. And so that may be kind of part of what's going on here. But like I said, it doesn't specify that with the fowls in particular, but it does fall in line. Now, there's also a whole lot of discussion about what exact birds are talked about here. Several commentaries think that the first mention of owl was talking about ostriches. I don't know why exactly, but that seems to be a fairly common idea based on the terminology, the Hebrew language that's used there. Some of the others that we read through, like the swan, you wouldn't think of that as being a bird of prey, but one thing I read said that was probably a particular species of hawk. Remember that when this was translated into English, although it was translated a long time ago, into old, what we consider Old English, it was still a much newer language than Latin, And it was a different region, different people, and so they're taking the name of a species of bird and they're trying to convert it into another, an English version of that same thing, perhaps without knowing exactly what that species is to start with. And so there may be some confusion in that, but I think the point is that the Jews that Moses and Aaron were relaying this to, they knew exactly, however many birds this is, they knew exactly what they were talking about. And they knew what was forbidden, they knew what was acceptable in terms of the kind of animals that they could eat. There wasn't any confusion there. So, moving on, the last section deals with winged insects, verses 20 through 24. All the fowls that creep going upon all fours shall be an abomination unto you, yet these shall ye eat of every flying creeping thing that goeth upon all fours, which have legs under their feet, and leap withal upon the earth. Even these of them ye may eat, the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. But all other flying creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until the even. So, verse 20, we see, again, the generic term fowl. Obviously, we're not talking about birds here, right? We're talking about bugs, creeping things that have wings but crawl on the ground. And the ones that were permitted are probably 4 varieties of locusts. Again, what we have here, it says beetle specifically. That's the one that's kind of the outlier. This is, again, the Hebrew term links more to locust than it does to beetle. But there were some insects, probably 4 different species or 4 different types of locusts. This wasn't uncommon for them to eat. You remember in the New Testament, what John the Baptist, he ate locusts, right? And so those were permitted. It was acceptable. And it is a good source of protein. So, if you ever want to try it out, go find some locusts and have at it. I've actually got some crickets or something or other that I think Cademan got me when he went somewhere. They're ranch flavored. Still haven't tried them yet, so I can't speak to that. But anyway, I don't think crickets would actually count because they're not locusts. But we're not Jewish, so it doesn't really matter. Anyway. So you've got these particular creeping things, these locusts or bugs that were permissible, the rest are not. And again, he lays out the restriction, don't eat these things, don't touch these things, don't have anything to do with these things, or you are considered ceremonially unclean. So that's, again, a familiar warning that we've seen throughout this section, but it highlights that idea of separation. You are to be separate. You are to be distinct from those things. You aren't supposed to have anything to do with them. And next week we'll move on and continue in chapter 11 that deals some more with the distinctions and the clean and unclean and the carcasses and all that. And well, not next week, I suppose, 2 weeks from now. Next lesson we'll cover those things unless Brother Caleb wants to tackle that. You're more than welcome. Just let me know. So any questions or comments?